LSE IDEAS, IISS, as well as the LSE South Asia Centre, which we started because we thought that this was a very, very important topic and a theme to discuss, which is how the geopolitics of the region of South Asia has changed dramatically in the last few years for various reasons surrounding South Asia, which may not necessarily traditionally have been seen as part of South Asia. I am delighted to say that there will be another event, a second roundtable in February next year. But at the moment, we get on with today's event. And it is now my pleasure to introduce the panelists to you. Going by the alphabet, I'm delighted to introduce Filippo Boni, who is lecturer in politics and international studies at the Open University in the United Kingdom and is a specialist in the politics of Chinese investments in South Asia. Lili, who is going to join us anytime now, is Deputy Director General and Senior Fellow at the Institute for International Relations in Tsinghua University in Beijing. Rahul Roy-Chaudhury is Senior Fellow for South Asia at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, that's IISS, and one of our collaborators in this event in London. And Nilanthi Samaranayake is Director Strategy and Policy Analysis Program at the Center for Naval Analyses, that's better known as CNA, in Virginia, United States, and is an expert on China's maritime presence in South Asia. Chris Alden is Professor of International Relations here at the London School of Economics and is co-director of LSE IDEAS, who are the other collaborators in this event. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Chris, who will moderate today's discussion. Chris.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to kick off this particular session on geopolitics. Again, I thank my colleagues at the South Asia Centre, Nilanthi, and at IISS, Rahul, and the panelists. I wanted to, before we started, just wanted to say a few remarks about the topic. I think that when facing this topic or addressing this topic, we all cast our minds back to the 1960s, and we think about history. And history, of course, as Mark Twain says, doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme sometimes. I think of Asian giants reframing global politics against a backdrop of systemic change for Western states whose preeminent position was dethroned or destabilized at that time. I think that we're clearly entering another moment where this sort of transformative systemic factors are reshaping global events, but the two Asian giants are themselves intermeshed in their own contestation and cooperative strategies. The metaphors that we speak of, be it string of pearls, ring of fire, these are things that speak to encirclement, and it speaks to a kind of tension that is in the region, one that is both in the maritime and in the upper reaches of the Himalayas. And I think that ultimately this topic reminds us too of cautionary tales. It's the delusions of capacity, overextension, military commanders operating on their own, and the role of leaders' visions of their visionary or lack of visionary approach to managing conflict and conflict that gets out of hand. So I think it's important for us to keep those sort of framing ideas in mind, reminding ourselves that history doesn't repeat itself, but we do really need to be focused on the seriousness of this particular issue, this area, and treat it with that. And I know my colleagues and the likes share my concerns, so I would like to ask Filippo to speak for some time on that.
Thank you very much, Professor Alden, and I'm very grateful to Nilanthi and Dr. Sarkar and the LSE South Asia Centre for inviting me to contribute to this roundtable. In these brief introductory remarks, I will try to make three points. One around the economic impact that Chinese investment had in BRI partner countries. The second one about the sort of existing gap that we see between a sort of narrative and reality in how BRI projects are portrayed and how they actually unfold on the ground. And finally, I think another very important point about how Chinese investments are internalized in the domestic politics of recipient countries. And to make these points, what I will use the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, Cpec, as a sort of illustrative example of some of the wider trends that we can identify across South Asia. I will make links to other cases as well, but I think Cpec provides for us an ideal vantage point to observe these dynamics, as it has the largest amount of BRI investment to date in South Asia, and it was defined as the flagship project of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and it was made by Beijing as a sort of poster child for the BRI. So I think it can tell us a lot about the dynamics we're discussing here today. So in relation to the first point about economic impact, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor for both Beijing and Islamabad represented an opportunity to expand the Sino-Pakistani partnership, which has always been based around the security dimension. It was an opportunity for them to sort of expand it into other domains and to build the economic pillar, which wasn't really there until up to 2013. And one of the immediate consequences that we've seen around this is that, yes, bilateral trade has increased, but at the same time, so did Pakistan's trade deficit with China. That in financial year 2017-2018, it was at $14 billion US. It was at the highest level in years. It dropped a little bit in 2018-2019 to around 11 billion, but I think it tells us a lot about how the economic dimension has expanded. And while the trade deficit, it's a trend that has really characterized the economic pillar of the relationship ever since the 1960s and 70s, the surge in this trade deficit was primarily due to the Cpec-related imports of heavy machinery to be used on Cpec projects. So increased trade deficit as a result of BRI-related investments is a trend that was also highlighted by a recent Chatham House report on Sri Lanka that noted how overall trade deficit with China, Sri Lanka's trade deficit with China as a share of Sri Lanka's GDP went from 2.6% between 2006 and 2012 to minus 4.3% between 2013 and 2019. And this was linked by this report to an increase in Chinese infrastructure investment. The second point I would like to make relates to a sort of broader pattern that we see about the persistent gap between what happens on the ground and how it is described or announced. And to make sense of the BRI and the related investments coming with it, I think it's important to be mindful of the difference between what the original investment announced and the fanfare around it is, and what is actually materializing on the ground. And here again, I mean, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor represents a very interesting example because the original sum announced was around $46 billion in 2015. Other projects were added to the lot until 2018, and the numbers were brought up to 62 billion, but the actual amount, it's around 25 to 29 billion dollars, which is not to say that this is not a huge amount of money. It is indeed, but it's less than how the narrative would portray it. And with specific reference to Pakistan, I mean, again, if we look at the conditions in 2013 when the original investments were announced, I think this is quite a significant amount of money in it, and it had significant results. Also considering that most of the energy projects that were the main focus of the first phase were completed and actually contributed around 5,000 megawatts to the national grid. But again, here, the overall investment is lower than when it was originally envisaged. So in order to get a better sense of how things are unfolding on the ground, there is the need to sort of sift through public announcement and trace what happens on the ground, which is not always the easiest thing to do. The final point I would like to make pertains to how these investments have been internalized into the domestic politics of recipient countries. and how China's strategic choices regarding the Belt and Road Initiative and its investments in South Asia interacted with local context. And what we've seen in Pakistan is that the BRI projects have been at the center of really political infighting, whether it was about center-provincial relations on where projects should have been allocated, which is something I've looked at in previous work, or whether it was about the overall control of the project in Pakistan's civil-military equilibrium. All these dynamics have sort of translated into China having to deal with complex domestic political systems that have their own priorities, agendas, and actors. And I think, especially in relation to the actors, one of the important points that needs to be emphasized is how the change in leadership, it's a factor that really needs to be taken into consideration, and I think spans across both South Asian contexts, but also other parts where the BRI is being in other BRI partner countries. And Pakistan, again, it's an interesting example. It was one of the chief enthusiasts of the Belt and Road Initiative, but after the sort of change in leadership that occurred in 2018, with the ascent to power of a more skeptical party led by Prime Minister Imran Khan, what we've seen is a Cpec reaching a de facto stalling point, with only a sort of more recent modest revival. And I think this represents a powerful reminder of the importance that local realities play and the agency they are able to exercise alongside China's interests in the way in which BRI projects unfold on the ground. So I think I'll stop here my very brief introductory remarks, and I very much look forward to the ensuing discussion.
Thank you, Filippo. Just to welcome Lily, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm going to now turn to our second speaker who will have some opening remarks. Nilanthi, if you could share with us your perspective.
Sure. Thank you very much, Chris. And thank you to Nilanjan for the invitation and the opportunity to share some of my personal research and observations from studying this region. I was asked to speak about the ring of maritime port infrastructure that China has created in South Asian countries, such as Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan. And some observers, as you know, we've already discussed today, some call it a Chinese string of pearls, and they see these pearls as surrounding or dotting the Indian peninsula. And for those who aren't familiar with the discourse, we're now about 15 years into this phenomenon where China has built port facilities, port terminals, and more broadly maritime infrastructure in locations such as Gwadar, Pakistan, Colombo and Hambantota, Sri Lanka, Chittagong, Bangladesh, and Maldives. And a persistent concern is that China could convert one of these commercial facilities in the region somehow for military use. And my presentation, I think, will pick up where Filippo has focused on Pakistan. My presentation will really focus on the smaller countries of South Asia and their perspective, so namely Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Maldives. So against this backdrop, I want to make a few points. First is methodological. So when reviewing these discussions about China and South Asia, I think we need to separate out Pakistan from the smaller South Asian countries. The China-Pakistan relationship, it's longstanding and it predates China's Belt and Road Initiative activities. And Pakistan has a dynamic in South Asia that is fundamentally different from the smaller South Asian countries. Given the long-standing conflict between India and Pakistan, the multiple wars that these two countries have fought against one another, and also their nuclear power status in terms of military capabilities. So I see Pakistan as residing in a different category than the smaller countries of South Asia. My second point is one where I see these smaller countries as really having jumped on this connectivity bandwagon. And it's been really a matter of blind faith almost from these countries' perspectives, where they see greater connectivity as the ticket to the prospect of greater economic wins. And so we have seen in these smaller countries an insatiable appetite for ports, airports, roads, highways, railways, essentially seeking greater internal connectivity within each of these countries and external connectivity. And I think part of this has been that assumption that has undergirded globalization for the last 20 years, that greater connectivity is really the ticket to economic success or wins. And I think COVID is causing us to rethink this assumption. Is connectivity, to what extent is that ultimately a good thing? Because we're seeing the limits of connectivity and connectivity dependent industries, such as tourism, which is important in South Asia for bringing in national income. So the smaller countries of South Asia, essentially they want more development. They're trying to meet their national economic goals. And these three countries, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Maldives, they're maritime South Asian countries. So they're effectively seeking to leverage their position in the maritime domain and the desire for more enhanced infrastructure as a way to expand their ties to regional and global trading networks. And I think I'll echo a point that Filippo mentioned, which I thought was interesting in the Pakistan case, that in looking at the smaller South Asian countries, these Chinese projects have been driven by the smaller South Asian countries. This is not a situation where we're seeing Beijing dictating down to Maldives, Beijing dictating to Bangladesh. The research really suggests a bottom-up demand signal for these projects from within South Asia. So in this respect, China is an attractive development partner, although sometimes it's a fallback option when other sources of investment and other sources perhaps more desirable of investment, they are not forthcoming from multilateral development banks and Japan. My third point is that the leaders from the smaller South Asian countries, they understand India's threat perceptions. And in fact, they go out of their way to emphasize their refusal to permit China to establish bases in their territory when this discussion comes up about ports and the use of them for potential military bases. Instead, they will respond with their India first policies and the fact that they are sensitive to India's security concerns. And there's a reason for this. These countries have experienced the negative repercussions of crossing India. They have experienced India's economic reach, India's military reach, its intelligence, operational reach. So this possibility, it's never far from these leaders' minds. And I think it's notable that despite this dominant narrative about the string of pearls in the region for about the 15 plus years, where was the first ever Chinese overseas military base stood up? I think many observers over the years expected that it would be in South Asia, but it was not in South Asia, it was in Africa. So I think that as analysts, it forces us to consider essentially why this was the case and to consider some limiting factors for Chinese activities in South Asia. But my final point is, I think it's still important to monitor the potential indicators of a substantive shift in the Indian Ocean and the South Asian order, despite the current limited scope really of Chinese presence in South Asia, and especially when you consider the asymmetry of power when looking at China and India with regard to the smaller South Asian countries. And we can talk a little bit more about what some of those indicators will be, but I'll stop there.
Great, thank you very much. If I can ask Lily to speak on her view of the subject.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry for my, I'm being late because I made a mistake of the time difference. Yeah, I'm really sorry. many thanks for LSE and IISS for inviting me. It's my great honor to be involved in this important webinar. Today, I would like to share with you some of my personal observations of the topic, China in South Asia. The first point or the first question I would like to address is why China in South Asia? How South Asia matters to China. First of all, as we know, China is not far away from South Asia, or South Asia is not far away from China. China actually shares borders with 5 of the 8 SAARC members, almost 2,000 kilometers with India, 1,400 kilometers with Nepal, almost 600 kilometers with Pakistan, 500 kilometers with Bhutan, and 92 kilometers with Afghanistan. So to a certain extent, China is a part of South Asia. So it's an immediate neighborhood of China. South Asia matters to China, I think, in terms of peace and tranquility of the border areas. As we know, China still has unresolved border disputes with India and Bhutan. And South Asia matters also in terms of the development and stability of China's landlocked West and Southwest region. I will go in details later. And also South Asia matters to China in terms of the safety of the slug in Indian Ocean. As you know, China is highly dependent on imported energy and foreign trade, and a large amount of this energy and foreign trade dependent on this slug, especially across the Malacca Strait. And the second point I would like to share is that I think China has been enjoying good relations with South Asia, despite some ups and downs in China-India relations, and also not yet established diplomatic relations with Bhutan. China has provided developmental, social and humanitarian aid to many South Asian countries, especially when those countries was confronted with natural disasters, including cyclone, tsunami, earthquake, and also China, made some, economic help to provide some kind of economic aid to Afghanistan in terms of the reconstruction. And also China and India are the developmental partners. The third point I would like to make is that China's economic relations with South Asia are not new. China's economic cooperation with South Asia has increased along with China's Go Global strategy and the Western development strategy. Both started around the year of 2000. The Go Global strategy is to encourage the Chinese companies to invest and do business overseas at the backdrop of globalization. And the Western development strategy aims to balance the growth between the Western part and the Eastern part of China. And India used to be the #1 destination of China's overseas contract projects in South Asia. And the Hambantota port project funded by China started in 2007. And the BCIM economic corridor was initiated by China's Yunnan province in 1999. Actually, the Yunnan province want to, through this BCIM, to change it from a remote and landlocked boundary area into an opening up front of China. The fourth point is that, according to the above analysis, you can see BRI cooperation in South Asia is a continuity and combination of this China's Go Global strategy and the Western development strategy. So the essence of BRI is development. And the second feature of BRI is that those projects are planned and proposed by the host or recipient countries. And for example, the Gwadar port or the Hambantota port, and the host or recipient countries have a high expectation to take a ride of China's fast growth. This brings to the third feature of BRI in South Asia. The expectations, in my own understanding, are too high. BRI is not a panacea. Reform is the final determinant of the host country's economic growth. The fourth feature of BRI is that China's BRI expects to improve regional and sub-regional integration in South Asia, including India, such as the BCIM economic corridor, and also China-Nepal-India economic corridor initiative. The last point I would like to make here is that geopolitics plays a significant role in perceptions of China's role in South Asia. It also has impacts on China's policy choice. In terms of the Indo-Pak relations, China felt comfortable to pursue an even-handed policy between India and Pakistan when the two countries tried to find the creative resolution of the Kashmir issue through their back-channel talks, I think maybe 10 years back. And China is also keen to join the South Asian integration process based on the Indo-Pak rapprochement. China has donated over $1 million to the SAARC Development Fund, but I think before 2014. And in terms of the China-US relations, South Asia has been a place for cooperation between them, such as the joint statement on South Asia in 1998, and the commitment to strengthen cooperation in South Asia in 2009, during the Obama visit to Beijing. There was also joint training of the Afghan diplomats. Now, the US is leaving Afghanistan and changed its strategic focus to great power competition. The US Indo-Pacific strategy regards India as a major partner. So my question is how this strategy evolves will determine the future of South Asia's strategic picture. I hope South Asia will be more integrated rather than divided. I just stop here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for your presentation. Can I ask Rahul Roy-Chaudhury, please?
Thank you, Chris. In my introductory remarks, I will focus on India's perspective towards China in South Asia and make three fundamental points. First, that the recent violent border clashes between Indian and Chinese troops have raised tensions and worsened bilateral relations. Second, this is likely to sharpen India's existing competition with China in South Asia and the broader Indian Ocean region into what I would describe as a possible contestation on defense and security issues. And finally, that such a potential Indian security-focused regional policy is not risk-free and needs to be imaginatively and sensitively handled and applied by New Delhi if it is to result in political and diplomatic dividends for it. Let me begin with the India-China clashes on the line of actual control in the Galwan Valley in Ladakh, the worst of which took place 3 months ago, in which 20 Indian soldiers and an officially unacknowledged number of Chinese soldiers were killed. This is important because this was the first time in 45 years that Indian soldiers had died on the Sino-Indian border. This represented a robust policy of India's Modi government to confront Chinese troops physically and assert physical presence over disputed territorial areas. It also represents, I believe, a fundamental change in India's perception of China. In the past, the cooperative elements of trade and commercial links had been satisfactorily compartmentalized alongside the competitive elements of the relationship, including on the border dispute. But I believe this is likely to change now. This is not to say that the cooperative elements of the relationship, both bilaterally and multilaterally, including China being India's largest trade partner, are expected to be disrupted, but that the competitive elements of the relationship are likely to get higher priority in the Modi government's decision-making process. Notably, India's punitive response for the Galwan Valley clash included the banning of social media apps and the removal of Chinese technology company Huawei from India's 5G competition. Let me now take this primacy of competitive bilateral relations between India and China to the regions of South Asia and the Indian Ocean. And here I exclude Pakistan, which, as we heard earlier, has a different relationship with China than the other parts of South Asia. This region, South Asia and the Indian Ocean, is essentially, as my IISS colleague Desmond Bowen has put it, is essentially India's front yard rather than its backyard that we often think of it as. And in effect, India's existing competition with China in both these regions is likely to sharpen considerably. India was the first major country to formally oppose China's Belt and Road Initiative, and it refused to officially attend both BRI forums held so far in China. India's public objection to BRI focuses on its flagship project, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor that we've heard Filippo talk about. India considers Cpec projects in Gilgit-Baltistan and Pakistan-administered Jammu and Kashmir, both of which New Delhi claims as part of its own Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh Union territories, as a violation of Indian sovereignty. India's security community also remains concerned over the strategic impact of BRI, especially in relation to China's expanding role and influence in the South Asian and the Indian Ocean region that Nilanthi has mentioned just now. This has resulted in the establishment, as Nilanthi mentioned, of China's first overseas military base in the Indian Ocean in Djibouti off the Horn of Africa 3 years ago, the supply of submarines, 2 submarines to Bangladesh, the first joint military exercise with Nepal, and 2 visits by a Chinese conventional submarine to Sri Lanka. To counter China's influence and growing influence in its front yard, India has sought to deepen maritime security and defense cooperation in the region, areas in which it has considerable advantage at the moment over China. This is now expected to include the activation of first-time defense-related lines of credit to Bangladesh, Mauritius, and the Seychelles, and potentially to Sri Lanka, and the completion of maritime surveillance projects in Sri Lanka, Mauritius, and the Seychelles. Last week, India's Army Chief and Foreign Secretary made a joint visit to Myanmar, reportedly to discuss defense cooperation measures. India will also likely seek the reactivation of its trilateral maritime security cooperation initiative with the Maldives and Sri Lanka, which has been lying dormant for the past 6 years, along with its long-planned expansion with inclusion of Mauritius and Seychelles as full members of this group. And deeper security links are likely to be built with a Quad group of countries, the US, Japan, and Australia, both bilaterally and multilaterally. Last month's defense and security agreement between the Maldives and the US symbolizes growing convergence between India and the US in the Indian Ocean. But, and this is my final point, India's possible contestation with China on defense and security ties in South Asia and the Indian Ocean does not come risk-free. This will lead to critical rhetoric, as we have already seen in relation to the US-Maldives defense agreement, and likely other putative responses from China. India's leverage with its immediate neighbors will also continue to be hampered by the neighborhood priorities of its domestic politics. In May 2020, for example, Nepal's new map showed for the first time areas of dispute with India. At the same time, India needs to be sensitive to the concerns of regional states, especially when they strive to balance their security links with India and their trade and credit ties with China, especially during the ongoing challenging COVID-dominant economic environment. In August 2020, for example, Sri Lanka stated it would keep its India first approach on security matters, but would pursue a neutral foreign policy. In essence, and I conclude, when India seeks diplomatic dividends for a heightened security-led initiative in the region in relation to China, it will need to be imaginative in policy formulation, ensure project implementation, and most importantly, be sensitive to the concerns of its smaller neighbors. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. A very broad sweep of the actors, both large and small in the region. I'd like to speak directly to the audience and ask them to for questions. Please bring your questions to the Facebook page, and that will be the way to communicate with our speakers. While those are being collected, I wanted to ask a general question for myself about the recent disputes and conflicts in the Himalayas, and I wanted to ask if the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which India has a observer status, I believe, and of course in China and Pakistan are full members. And I'm just wondering if there was any word coming out of that organization which purports to deal with security issues at the state level, if there's anything anyone wanted to contribute on that point. A resounding silence.
Well, Chris, let me begin. I think it's an important question you've asked, and Lily will know more about this. But my sense is that with both India and Pakistan members of the SCO, a group that has traditionally been dominated by China and Russia, there has been in the past exercises, joint counterterrorism exercises among the countries of the membership, including India and Pakistan. There was a meeting recently of the SCO, a virtual meeting, which I think had some issues, especially between India and Pakistan. But my sense is that in this new thinking that is emerging from New Delhi, it is likely that multilateral security cooperation, such as counterterrorism exercises, the next edition of counterterrorism exercises, will have problems and likely to be postponed before they actually take place. So I think this will be another area where there will be an impact on the bilateral India-China relations seen at a multilateral level.
Maybe, yeah. May I add a point?
Please do.
Okay. Yeah, I think if I'm correct, I think both India and Pakistan have already become a formal member of SCO. It might be in 2017. Yeah, so I think at the very beginning, people expect that this SCO will provide a platform for India and Pakistan to interact, because they, they stopped their bilateral talk several years back. But this time now, China and India have some problem in the border area right now. But according to my own understanding, China and India, they still want to have it solved bilaterally. But SCO actually provides a platform for them to meet increase the opportunities for them to meet, even though, especially when the tensions was very high, So it happened already in the past several months. So I think my point is they want to have their own problem solved bilaterally first, but maybe to a certain extent, this SCO cooperation may be affected to to a certain extent if the tension continues. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That gives us a context. Thank you for taking that question. I still waiting for some of the questions to come in on the Facebook side of things. And while I'm doing that, if I might direct a question to Filippo and possibly Nilanthi as well. The economic engagement, which you both gave some emphasis to, is of course often cast as cooperative conduct, and in contrast to, say, security, territorial concerns, and all of these other elements. And yet, if I heard you correctly, the economic engagement, be it the corridor and the internal dissent generated in Baluchistan, or be it the question of debt and port facilities and all of those, the economic engagement itself has proven internally somewhat divisive as well. Why is it that we persist in talking about it in cooperative language as an alternative to security? And I'm just wondering if I'm missing something here, if you could elaborate on that. Perhaps Filippo first, since you...
Yeah, sure. I think, economic engagement was divisive, and I think it relates to the final point that I've made about agency in recipient countries, and I think it was divisive because of the way in which the initial phases were managed, with not so much transparency in the way in which projects were allocated, and there were claims around the corridor having 3 different routes. What we've seen is that it actually prioritizes certain parts of Pakistan going through Sindh and Punjab, as opposed to Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Baluchistan. So I think it was an issue of governance to a certain extent. One of the reasons why it was divisive, and I think that it's interesting also to see how the overall evolution has played out in terms of the economic engagement. We've seen the first phase, which was very much on the sort of energy projects, power projects, which was also one of the main agenda items of the ruling party at the time, the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz. As soon as the leadership changed as a result of the elections, priorities shifted as well, and that's also had an impact in the way in which Chinese economic engagement in Pakistan unfolded on the ground. So I think that's one of the trends that we've seen as far as Pakistan is concerned. This is not to say that there is no support for Cpec in the country. It's quite the opposite. But I think it's from a general initiative enthusiasm that we've seen, there is a much more cautious approach now.
Thank you very much. Nilanthi?
Sure. It's a good question, Chris. I think there are a couple reasons that can explain that. that discussion. I think first is, at least from the perspectives of the smaller South Asian countries, they're really under-examined, understudied. There's not as much attention to them as, of course, the larger countries in the region, such as India, Pakistan, and China. A lot of the study of South Asia, I think, has been dominated by those. But yeah, I think when you get to a more granular level, when we're talking about issues of debt and port developments, I think the Sri Lanka case is usually sort of exhibit A. People will point to Hambantota. But I think each of these projects are very different. Hambantota, of course, was funded on loans, but you look at China's port terminal in Colombo Port, and that's FDI. So it depends on the level of detail when we're talking about these topics. And I think Sri Lanka, when you look at the overall percentage of Chinese debt, it's roughly the same as Sri Lanka's debt to Japan and to the Asian development banks. So it really, I think there's a lack of understanding, maybe perhaps a lack of study to what the actual numbers are. But then I think on a certain point, it doesn't matter for some observers. I often think of these smaller countries as the data point countries. Whichever thesis an observer has, I notice they tend to throw in and Maldives and Bangladesh, and they'll just kind of use it to support whatever their point is. So I think on some level, it's for a lot of observers, it kind of doesn't matter what the underlying numbers are. But I think when you dig deeper to actually look at the project, at the unit of analysis, I think you'll actually see it's a more complicated story. Even with the Hambantota case, which was funded by loans, but the final deal to assign operations management was actually through FDI. So it's very different, and I think it is more indicative of a deeper structural debt situation that Sri Lanka has as a middle income country that is losing access to concessional assistance and really seeks a host of development providers. So.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. Looking at the sort of granular rationales there, one can read the same story in a somewhat with a somewhat well, certainly a richer portrayal of what exactly are motivations here, and the motivations are not necessarily at state level. They're found within at actor level, at even regime or politician level, shall we say? I see a number of questions here, so I'm going to start with one of them. This person has asked, can anyone help me understand the place of Gilgit-Baltistan and its status in the regional equation? There are rumors that it may be considered a fifth province in Pakistan. Would China have a role there, and what's India's position? I don't know if anyone who wants to take that, Mute. Sorry, your mute is mute. I think if Rahul, your mute is still on.
Can you hear me?
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
This is more, Gilgit-Baltistan is part in geography located on the China, Ladakh sort of area, where it has been controlled by Pakistan for very, very many years. There have been rumors and speculation that it will be incorporated formally. It has a different status compared to the other provinces, 4 provinces of Pakistan, that will be incorporated into Pakistan as a formal province. But we haven't seen any substantive evidence-based rationale for that. But remember, this area is traditionally has historically been an area of dispute between India and Pakistan, where India has in its maps has stake claim to Gilgit-Baltistan area, and as well as the Pakistan administered Kashmir. Pakistan has continued to assert control geographically over it. And of course, because it is in the broad, the Ladakh area, in that sense, there is a China angle on this. But I think it is more issue of India and Pakistan, primarily Pakistan domestic, then India, Pakistan, and then a regional context of China.
Great. Is there anyone else who wants to jump in on that, or?
I think just very briefly, if I may, there have been proposals which were ventilated recently by the Minister of Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan Affairs on the Pakistani side about the intention of sort of giving official provincial status to Gilgit-Baltistan. And as far as Cpec is concerned, I mean, that has always been considered a key component of it, as it provides the sort of bridge with China as well. Actually, I mean, in the second phase of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, we've seen a progressive shift from energy generation projects in the first phase to agricultural projects and special economic zones. And actually, one of the economic zones which is going to be developed, or at least it's envisaged at this stage, is actually in Gilgit-Baltistan. So I think there is clear an interest there as far as Pakistan and Cpec are concerned.
Just a few points, because it touched upon China's role in this region. My understanding is that from the Chinese point, this area is an internal issue of Pakistan, definitely. And I think when the bilateral talk, I mean, between Pakistan and India was there, I think China support the Kashmir issue be resolved bilaterally by India and Pakistan. But since the talk stopped for several years, and now I think the latest announcement or policy from the Chinese government is that China supports this issue to be resolved through both the UNSC resolutions and the bilateral agreements between India and Pakistan. And finally, I think there was a border agreement between China and Pakistan. It was in 1963. In that agreement, you can check it. It's the border between China and Pakistan in the disputed area between India and Pakistan. I mean, that is the Pakistan-controlled Kashmir. I mean, in that agreement, it said it's a temporary agreement. It depends on the final agreement between India and Pakistan, and then China will decide the final border area with the Pakistan-controlled Kashmir. Yeah, you can check that the pact in 1963.
So a lot of business left over from that period, which is still at play. Yeah. There's a question here directed towards Rahul, asking to explain the Indian response to developments in Afghanistan, with the peace talks starting and a US administration giving further signals of withdrawal. Can India change its engagement patterns here?
Sure. I think clearly India has been an important player for Afghanistan's politics over the last few years. It is primarily a development partner of Afghanistan and has contributed in terms of economic and development projects. Also, there are very strong people-to-people links between India and Afghanistan. On the peace process, India has supported the Afghan government on this. and has not had any outreach to the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, who clearly are now the negotiating sort of team with the Afghanistan government. This, by a number of analysts, this is considered to be a problem for India in the future of Afghanistan and its politics. Abdullah, the chairman of the High Peace Council, was in Delhi a few days ago talking about about the negotiating process. And I think there is an attempt to get India involved in the process. But the problem for New Delhi is one of recognizing the Taliban, which it has not done so far. But my sense is that, and my view, personal view, is that it's important for India to understand the shifting politics in Afghanistan, to clearly, substantively and symbolically tell the Afghan people and the government that they support peace in the region and stable Afghanistan, and have an outreach to the Taliban, which everyone else has been doing and continues to do so. So I think at the moment, India is in an awkward position, not having the outreach to the Taliban publicly. But India, I think, is waiting for some development in the ongoing negotiating process in Doha to provide an outreach to the Taliban. I think that outreach, public outreach, will take place sooner rather than later, and India will then be, along with other countries, a key participant for the peace process formally as well.
Thank you very much. There is, would anyone like to come in on that point as well? I know it was directed to Rahul, but no? Okay, there's another question directed to the panel. Modi has been badly bruised by Chinese aggression, so I'm quoting the question. Now he has sought talks with Pakistan. Will he restore Article 370, 370, and sign a border agreement on Chinese terms so as to avert a heavy defeat in war with China? So I suppose that this is, again, has Rahul in mind, but I think Lile and perhaps some of the others as well will want to comment on it.
Sure. I mean, I think, I would challenge the assumption that Modi, Prime Minister Modi, is bruised by the clashes with China in the Ladakh area. What we've seen is that subsequent to the clashes, there's been a huge sort of upsurge of nationalism in India, supporting the sort of more assertive measures of the Modi government that I mentioned in my introductory remarks. I think the key question really will be the balance, the new balance, I think, that we are looking at between the cooperative and the competitive elements of the India-China relationship. And it's a hugely important relationship to India. China, as I mentioned, is India's largest trading partner. There are supply side links here, logistics chain. So no one wants disruption between the two countries in this area. But there is, I think, a new normal developing and a new balance that will be required for a greater effectiveness and improvement of and lowering of tensions on the India-China dispute. Possibly with the winter conditions now set in, we don't expect any serious encounter in the line of actual control for the next few months, till spring at least. So that gives us a few weeks and months to see what both countries can work towards. Having said that, I'm not aware that India or Prime Minister Modi have put across an outreach to Pakistan for talks. That still is stuck on the Modi government's view that there can be no talks until terrorism emanating from Pakistan ends. So I'm not aware of that initiative, if there is one indeed.
Lily, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, actually, to be frank, I didn't get the question quite clearly, but my understanding, according to Rahul's, explanation, my understanding is that definitely it is very pity that the border dispute continues, or the border tension continues between China and India right now. And this time, I think the difference or the concern for the future China-India relations is that will it be a paradigm shift in managing these bilateral relations? Because, since 1988, the paradigm is that we agree to put our difference or the border disputes aside and continue cooperation in other areas. But this time, especially from the Indian side, it seems that especially after the bloody conflict in Galwan, Indians started to try to ban some Chinese investment or apps, or ban Chinese companies to be the Indian public projects, right? Something like that. It seems that Indians started to relink the border disputes and economic cooperation together. So that will be very difficult in the future. I mean, it will be, we came to what happened during the so-called Cold Peace between 1962 to 1988. So I think it's time for the two sides, especially I think the Indian side, to let's retain to our consensus that we have to manage the border dispute well and continue cooperation in other areas. Otherwise, the mistrust will be, increased, or in a very, in a vicious cycle. Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if this offers a solution, but the next question asks whether new technology, renewable energy for IR, could help change the nature of geopolitics in South Asia. In other words, with this new generation technology, does it offer opportunities that could draw in, build new supply networks, development as a kind of bring resolution to the bubbling up of these tensions which we've mentioned? Anyone want to respond to that?
If I can just quickly, I mean, I'm not sure whether it will be able to sort of ease this kind of situation, but as far as new technology is concerned, I think that was an important component of the early phase of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. A fiber optic cable was built and was inaugurated in 2018. And it was one of the priority projects. It was built by an organization which is linked to the Pakistani military, and I think it demonstrates to an extent also the strategic importance that the sort of new technology may have. I mean, as far as Pakistan is concerned, a lot of there have been a lot of pilot projects around safe city projects, which are with putting cameras in, and a lot of these contracts were awarded to Chinese companies as well. So technology is indeed playing an important role. As far as Sino-Pakistani partnership is concerned, it's certainly sort of consolidating and furthering the cooperation between the two countries also, and I would say especially in the field of security.
Thank you. Thank you. Would anyone else like to jump in?
I'll just add that in our research on the Brahmaputra River, China, India, Bangladesh, all three are stakeholders on that. And there certainly is the potential for cooperation on river basin management there, and technologies such as hydropower, but it certainly suggests the potential for cooperation and building for the benefit of all three countries. But I think oftentimes there's a default to securitizing these types of projects or technology. So it's perhaps for policymakers, it requires an active awareness of that tendency, and really just persistence in terms of trying to pursue the cooperative. But when I heard the question, I immediately thought about the Brahmaputra River and the hydropower projects that can certainly lend themselves to cooperation. But we just clearly in this region, there's a tendency toward the securitization of some of these projects.
Thank you. Do you want to jump in on this as well, Rahul?
No, I think that's answered. Okay,
Lily?
Yeah, thank you, sir. I think this question actually provides a very, I think, very important angle. I think it's, if we just focus those traditional disputes or especially the territorial disputes, both between India and Pakistan and India and China, I think is a dead end. What I mean, it will take quite a long time to have it solved, and I don't think any military conflict, method will have it solved. It only will make it more complicated. So my understanding is that if we refocus on other areas, such as the current challenges to the region, like the pandemic, like the economic recovery, and also if the pandemic continues, the real challenge to this region is the poverty. That means a lot of people will return to poverty. That means after so many years efforts in alleviating this poverty, we will lose in this front. So I think both China and India and other countries in the region can cooperate and should cooperate in this area, including how to maybe distribute fairly in terms of the vaccine, and also how to promote the recovery of the economy, and also those as I mentioned, those projects, those sub-regional or regional initiatives are there. So I think if we focus on that, and also in terms of that renewable energy, it's about climate change cooperation. China and India cooperated quite well, I think, in the past, especially in 2009 Copenhagen, conventions. So I think, yeah, it's about the mindset.
Yeah, thank you. I had that very much in mind with my opening remarks. Was, BRICS and these sort of organizations, which are symbolic of a new era of cooperation. While on the Western side, we see the transformation of shifts in power and the like. So it seems to be paradoxical that we have these themes concurrently running. There's another question that just came up. Again, it's directed to Rahul, but I would take it that others can jump in as well. A 1993 agreement between the two countries, India and China, stipulates that neither side shall use force at the line of actual control, the de facto border, but violent high-altitude disputes have erupted several times. Military experts say one reason for the current face-off is that India has been building roads and airfields to improve transport links and narrow the gap with China's superior infrastructure on its side of the line of actual control. How far do you believe this conflict between two nuclear powers might go in the absence, might go forward?
I think the end of the question really says it all. India and China are two nuclear powers. You mentioned, Chris, in your introductory remarks, you know, the two largest countries in Asia. I mean, you know, there needs to be a sort of a good relationship between the two. There needs to be peace on the borders. There needs to be greater economic connectivity and cultural links, people to people. That's all very important, because I don't think either Beijing or from Delhi side, I don't think any of the two capitals or the countries want to go to war with each other and get into a conflict with each other. Unfortunately, there have been developments that have taken place in the last 3 months, which, as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, you know, have changed the normal that Dr. Lily mentioned also in her recent remarks, in terms of how India was perceiving these issues, and to bring back the relationship, to improve the relationship between the two countries, I think will require time. Both need to build trust in each other. We've seen over the last few weeks, there have been several rounds of talks between Indian and Chinese military officials and foreign ministry officials, which haven't really got anywhere in that sense. So I think both countries really need to have a mindset of moving forward in cooperation, and to ensure that the cooperative elements of the relationship are far more than the competitive elements. But it will take time. As I hinted, this may be the new normal that we are going through at the moment. Both countries, I think, have to change their mindsets. They have to make compromises. But no one, and I'm sure, as I said earlier, no one wants a conflict between these two nuclear powers. The question is, how do we bring back a sort of a more equitable political, diplomatic, economic, and security relationship between New Delhi and Beijing, when both are rising powers, when both do look at themselves as providing leadership in Asia. And it is important not only for the relation between the two countries, but for Asia, I think, not to get into confrontation or to take sides in a possible competitive relationship between India and China. But we still have a long way to go.
Great, thank you. Do any of those other panelists want to comment on that? If not, we have another question, which again directed across the panel. So feel free to step in. How can the Chinese presence in South Asia turn into influence? And what are the factors that influence can be measured by? It's almost an academic question in the sense of methods and what have you. But again, so if any of you care to speak to the Chinese presence and the degree of influence and how one would measure that influence. Nilanthi, do you want to give it a go?
Sure. I think this is a question that is often discussed about Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean, and to what extent does that translate into influence. I think that does require a serious academic discussion, but I think one thing I tried to suggest at the end of my presentation was, I think we can at least try to, right now we're looking at activities that China has. And sometimes I think there's a sense that there's a series of ones and zeros, that perhaps Chinese activities, all Chinese activities are almost of the same weight in some respects. When we see them in Maldives versus in Pakistan, there's different varying levels of concern. And I think we need to think about the larger histories of these bilateral relationships, that Chinese activities in some of the countries in the Western Indian Ocean, they might be different. But I try to just at least suggest that one method for doing this is to look at indicators and warnings. And really, you know, when I look at South Asia and each of the countries' relations with China, I see Pakistan. It's the only country that conducts regular bilateral naval exercises with China. So in terms of thinking about future indicators, one thing we can look at is if we were to see some of the smaller countries, Bangladesh, Maldives, Sri Lanka, if they were to start a series of a regular series of bilateral naval exercises with China, I think that would be an indicator that perhaps a shift is occurring in the South Asian and Indian Ocean regional order. So I think influence, that's a larger discussion in the literature that's worth investigating in a more robust manner. But I would just offer naval exercises as one potential indicator. Also, the base. People have pointed to China's military base in Djibouti, and people are thinking of where could the next base be, if at all, if a second base is even to be established. But I think that also reflects another indicator of Chinese presence in the region. Whereas I think right now, the discussion tends to be focused on Chinese activities, and there's almost a minimal amount of reflection about what the significance is of each of the activities. So I think we could go a little bit deeper there.
I think it's a very important question because very often we mistake Chinese presence for Chinese influence. And I think that is a mistake that in policy terms should not be made. We should be looking at Chinese influence. I mean, to me, that's where the key issue will be, the key areas to look at. Nilanthi had mentioned military exercises. I'd add two more, I think. One is, for example, I remember a few years ago going into Colombo and talking to the senior defense leadership there, and and looking basically at how India was dealing with Sri Lanka and how China was dealing with Sri Lanka. And a senior Sri Lankan official told me that, well, the advantage that China has over India is political, because when Indian officials come to Sri Lanka, they say, well, what are you doing over the Tamil issue? So the Chinese have no such interest on the political aspects of what happens inside Sri Lanka. And that's a big relief to us. Now, that was a few years ago. My sense is that is changing and has changed. In Sri Lanka, with Hambantota project, the economic aspect, there will be clearly influence over the nature of the economic relationship, the financial relationship, which we may not overtly see, but you could be perceived in different ways. So I think in Sri Lanka's case, I think there is, and even Pakistan's case, and Filippo would know more about this, the political impact that Cpec projects have. For example, in Punjab province of Pakistan, to what extent, how influential is the Chinese ambassador in Pakistan today? I mean, that's a question I often ask when I travel into Pakistan or India, is how influential are the ambassadors of these countries? And I remember in Pakistan a few years ago, the view was that the Saudis were the most powerful, they had the most powerful influence in that sense. And then you had China and some other countries. The US was off the list at that time. So I think the economic dimensions provide influence. Secondly, and I'll end on this one, the defense and security links are key. Now, for example, in 2017, China provided 2 submarines to Bangladesh. This deal was obviously came as a huge concern to India and the Indian security establishment. I mentioned this briefly in my remarks. But actually, if you look at what was supplied, the age of the submarines, the problem that the submarines have, in a way, the influence that would have been publicly perceived hasn't really taken place. And in a way, India made the right decision by not criticizing openly Sheikh Hasina for the decision, the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, which is a wise thing to do. So in a way, you have to be very careful over presence, influence, but also perceived influence and actual influence, I would argue. And actual influence is what, and a think tank like the IISS, we are trying to understand. So I think whoever asked the question, I think it's a great question, has tremendous relevance for a lot of Chinese and Indian activity. I mean, if you look at Nepal today, I would argue that India has lost the influence it had in Nepal. If the Nepali government and the parliament bring out a map that clearly lays down the disputed territory areas with India, never done before, it clearly is an indication of India losing influence in Nepal. So I think a fascinating question. I mean, I could go on, but I know Filippo and others want to come in.
If I may.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Filippo.
No, sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think it's an excellent question and something I think we've all been sort of grappling with in the past few years. And I mean, from a methodological standpoint, I think breaking down what influence means in the sense that, I mean, we need to break it down. Is it economic influence? Are we looking at political influence? Are we looking at security influence? So that's the first sort of breakdown that we need to provide. And as Nilanthi was saying before as well, indicators within each. An example from Pakistan, and I'll make this brief, and it's something which I think was demonstrated a clear shift from a pre-BRI condition situation and a post-BRI situation. I mean, what we've seen is that when there were protests in Pakistan against the PMLN government, the Chinese ambassador was a key interlocutor of the opposition party who had to go to the Chinese ambassador to reassure them that it was not against Cpec, it was more against the government. So I think if we're looking to measure actual influence, that's the sort of kind of evidence that we need to look for, in the sense how important and central an actor becomes in the day-to-day politics. And I think it relates back also to the last point that I was making in my introductory remarks. So how China's choices and strategies deal and adapt to an extent as well to the local context they're dealing with. So I think it works both ways. But I'll stop here. But I think it's a very interesting question and a difficult one as well.
I don't know, Lily, did you want to come in? We have one other question before we close. But did you want to come in on this last question we just mentioned?
Yeah. Only 2 points. As I mentioned, that why China in South Asia? Because China almost a part of South Asia. I mean, Chinese increasing cooperation or especially economic presence in South Asia, I think will be definitely. The second point is that why China have such kind of, we call it a supporting base in Djibouti. I mean, it's about how to support our naval anti-piracy operation, which started in 2008. It was regarded as public good in the Indian Ocean. The second is about the increasing Chinese investment and Chinese citizens in the littoral countries in Indian Ocean. I think China think about how to protect these overseas interests. Become critical since in 2011 when the Libyan crisis happened. Maybe you remember China has to evacuate as much as maybe 35,000 people from Libya, is really a surprise to the Chinese diplomat based there. They didn't know so many Chinese. So it's a challenge or a question for the Chinese government to answer how to protect those Chinese citizens and companies, overseas. Yeah.
If I can just throw in one other thing, is we tend to think of that base in Djibouti as an African base, but actually in 2013 it was Yemen across the water, not the Chinese citizens and other international citizens had to be evacuated from. So it actually is a springboard to go east as well as south or inland. Last question, very quickly, one of you could answer. It says, what was the recent move by the Indian government in Ladakh a provocation to China? So I wonder if perhaps Rahul could take that.
This refers to the revocation of Article 370 of the Indian Constitution, which took place on the 5th of August, or just over a year ago. Essentially, India created 2 new union territories from the erstwhile province of Jammu and Kashmir, the Jammu and Kashmir territory, and the Ladakh Union Territory. Now, when this was created, the Indian Home Minister made a statement in Parliament, I think strongly, possibly assertively talking about control over Ladakh, and that there was a larger part of Ladakh which was controlled by China. And I think the Chinese government had initially had a muted response, but there was a critical response. But after the events in Galwan in June this year, this issue came to the forefront as a possible catalyst, a trigger for the clash that happened in Galwan. My sense is that this could well be one of the factors for the Chinese assertiveness on the border and India's response. But I do not think it is the principal one or the only one. There are 3 or 4 other issues as well, including an earlier question had come on infrastructure that is being built, on patrolling on the line of actual control, on India's closer relations with the US, and 1 or 2 other issues. So I think it's an important element of the clash that took place, but I don't think it is the principal one.
Thank you very much, everyone. We have to draw this very interesting discussion to a close, I'm afraid. Can I begin with thanking our very, very loyal audience who have been with us all through. Some have come and some have gone, but there's been a loyal group that has been here and have been sending questions, and there have been comments as well. Thank you to all the participants. This is exactly what we wanted out of this kind of an event, is a conversation across topics and themes and perspectives. So we're delighted. This event will be available in about a week's time as a recording on our website. May I begin with thanking Nilanthi first, Nilanthi Samaranayake, simply because I forgot to mention when I introduced her at the beginning that Nilanthi is also an LSE alumnus, and we never miss to say that. That we're always delighted to have our alumnus back with us to be involved in some way or the other. So our thanks from the South Asia Centre, from LSE IDEAS, from IISS as collaborators of this event, to Nilanthi Samaranayake, who is in the United States at the moment, to Lili, who's at Tsinghua University in Beijing, and it must be close to midnight for you now. It is very, very late. And to Filippo Boni, who is actually quite close to LSE at the moment, but thank you very much. Thank you also to Rahul and to Chris for moderating this discussion. And we look forward to our next event. Goodbye.